If you listen closely to the world around you, you'll hear it the whisper that started long before anyone noticed. A quiet suggestion, almost gentle, slipping into conversations, classrooms, living rooms, and stories told by mothers who were still healing from wounds they never named. Before the anger, before the headlines, before the division, there was confusion. And if you stay with us until the end, you'll understand how that confusion became something far louder. Be careful around boys. Men only want one thing. Don't depend on a man. Not shouted, not forced, just repeated, softly at first, then louder as generations passed. These words didn't come from hatred. They came from tired women. Women who survived disappointments that they didn't have the language to describe. Women who watched their mothers lose themselves in marriages that demanded silence. Women who never learned how to ask for emotional safety and instead taught their daughters to build armor. The whisper carried frustration from one decade to the next. It carried the weight of women who were expected to be strong everywhere except inside their own hearts. And slowly, daughters absorbed the lessons not as caution, but as truth. Meanwhile, the boys grew up unaware that a story was being written about them. They grew into men who walked into relationships already tried, judged, and mistrusted without knowing why. The world didn't wake up one morning with women hating men. That isn't how division grows. It grows like a shadow, stretching slowly, starting from a place of pain that was never examined, only inherited. And as that whisper traveled across generations, it stopped sounding like protection and started sounding like prophecy. A prophecy both sides began to believe. Every era chooses a villain. Not always consciously, not always fairly. Sometimes, the choice isn't based on truth at all, but on convenience. And if you stay to the end of this video, you'll understand why men became the easiest target in a story that was never meant to be balanced. It started quietly, like most shifts do. The world discovered that conflict sells, tension keeps eyes glued to screens, outrage keeps conversations alive, and nothing fuels an audience like a clear antagonist. But villains don't need sharp teeth or dark cloaks. Sometimes, all they need is to be portrayed as clueless, careless, or emotionally absent. So commercials began to paint husbands as bumbling. Sitcoms turned fathers into punchlines. Talk shows rewarded applause whenever a man was shamed publicly. And slowly, a narrative took shape. Not because it was true, but because it was profitable. The media didn't ask whether the portrayal was fair. It didn't question what repeated humiliation might do to a generation of boys absorbing those scenes. It simply noticed which stories got the loudest reaction and leaned in. Classrooms added their own brushstrokes. Lessons about empowerment, well-intended, sometimes blurred into lessons about opposition. Young girls were told to be strong, independent, unstoppable. Young boys were told to be careful, apologetic, aware of their privilege, even when they didn't feel privileged at all. A subtle imbalance formed. Girls were taught to rise, boys were taught to redeem. By the time these children grew into adults, the script was already written. Men walked into the world carrying a weight they didn't understand. Women stepped into the world expecting a threat that wasn't always there. And together, they lived inside a story shaped by headlines, not humanity. A story that needed a villain more than it needed the truth. There was a time, not long ago, when femininity was allowed to be gentle. When softness was not a weakness, but a language. When a woman's tenderness wasn't questioned, criticized, or mistaken for submission. But something shifted. And if you stay with us till the very end, you'll see how that shift quietly rewired an entire generation. It didn't happen with anger. It happened with survival. As the message of empowerment spread, loud, bold, and necessary, it carried an unintended side effect. Strength became synonymous with hardness. Confidence began to mimic defensiveness, and many women learned that the safest way to move through the world was with armor, not openness. The feminine mirror, once reflecting warmth, started reflecting vigilance. Self-protection became a personality. Guardedness became a virtue. Feelings that once flowed freely were now filtered through suspicion. If I'm too soft, I'll be used. If I trust too quickly, I'll be hurt. If I need someone, I'll look weak. So walls were built. High, quiet, unbreakable walls. And the cost? It wasn't visible. It wasn't dramatic. It was silent. Partnerships stopped feeling like a sanctuary and became a performance. Men measured every word. Women checked every intention. Both carried stories they never wrote, but still lived inside. Relationships that once relied on curiosity now relied on caution. Family structures followed. Couples who should have grown together grew suspicious instead. Misunderstandings expanded into distance. Distance hardened into resentment. And soon, the idea of commitment felt heavier than the fear of being alone. Yet beneath the caution, both genders felt something they rarely admitted: grief. Private, quiet grief, a mourning for the softness they were told to suppress, the trust they were taught to withdraw, the connection they secretly craved but could no longer express without sounding weak. Women longed for safety without needing armor. Men longed for acceptance without needing perfection. But the world rewarded distance, rewarded independence, detachment, self-protection. So people pretended they didn't care. Pretended the loneliness didn't sting late at night. Pretended the longing wasn't human. This was the epidemic no one named. A generation trained to disconnect, aching for what they were taught to reject. But every narrative eventually breaks when reality becomes impossible to ignore. Slowly, society began to ask, is this really what we were meant for? People noticed the exhaustion, the dating fatigue, the emotional burnout, the quiet sadness behind strong facades. Men realized they weren't the villains they'd been cast as. Women realized they weren't meant to carry every burden alone. And somewhere in the middle, a truth resurfaced, one forgotten under decades of noise. Humans were not designed to fight each other. They were designed to understand each other. The reckoning wasn't dramatic. It didn't explode. It surfaced gently, like a tide returning to shore. Balance never left. It was simply buried. And now, piece by piece, it begins to rise again. Not through revolution, but realignment. Through small moments that rebuild trust, a man brave enough to express emotion without fear of ridicule. A woman resting her armor without fearing exploitation. Partnership is becoming a place to breathe, not perform. Love returning to its original form. Two humans choosing each other without inherited suspicion. Men rediscovering their strength not as dominance, but as steadiness. Women rediscovering their softness not as weakness, but as depth. And beneath all the conflict, one simple truth survives unchanged. We were never meant to stand alone on opposite sides. We were meant to meet in the middle, where balance has always been waiting. If this resonated with you, hit like, subscribe, and share. Let's start rebuilding the connection we've all been missing. Women began losing access to their own emotional language. Vulnerability, once natural, now felt dangerous. To open up meant risking judgment. To lean on someone meant risking disappointment. To love without calculation felt like stepping into a battlefield unarmed. The world applauded the armor, but never asked about the weight of carrying it. Inside, many women felt a conflict they couldn't name, a longing for connection fighting against a fear of being unprotected, a desire to be held, battling the instinct to hold themselves together at all times. Femininity didn't disappear. It just became hidden, pressed behind layers of self-defense, waiting for a moment when it would finally feel safe enough to breathe again. A moment society forgot to create. The shift didn't announce itself. It crept into boyhood, into classrooms, cartoons, and conversations boys were never meant to hear, but absorbed anyway. If you stay with this chapter until the end, you'll see why what followed was not anger, but withdrawal. Boys grew up watching fathers portrayed as fools, men mocked for their emotions, masculinity treated less like a human experience and more like a warning sign. No one told them directly that something was wrong with them, but the message settled in anyway. And when those boys became men, many didn't fight back. They simply stepped back, not out of pride, out of confusion. Fathers grew cautious, unsure how to lead without being labeled controlling, unsure how to discipline without being judged harshly. Many softened, not because they wanted to, but because they were afraid to be misunderstood. The world saw their distance and mistook it for apathy. But for men, silence often means they no longer feel safe enough to speak. So they retreated emotionally, quietly, invisibly. Relationships felt it first, families felt it next, society feels it now. This wasn't a battle that men started. It was a burden they carried, alone, unheard, and unnamed. The divide between men and women didn't grow on its own. It was fed, watered, strategically amplified. And if you stay with this chapter until the final line, you'll understand why unity was never the goal. Profit was. Corporations discovered early that fear sells faster than trust. Outrage spreads quicker than understanding, and suspicion keeps people online longer than harmony ever could. So algorithms learned our triggers, news outlets learned our fears, political agendas learned our pressure points. Slowly, men and women weren't simply living their stories, they were being steered into conflict. Ads began targeting women with messages of independence that subtly demonized men. Content creators leaned into male bashing or female shaming because it guaranteed clicks. Politicians used gender tension as leverage, knowing distracted citizens are easier to manipulate. The system didn't care about healing, it cared about engagement. And nothing engages like a good feud. Meanwhile, individuals paid the price. Men felt watched, judged, and pre-labeled. Women felt guarded, defensive, and exhausted. Both sides walked around expecting harm instead of connection. The truth is simple. Divided genders make powerful institutions stronger. But united genders? They become too wise, too stable, too difficult to control. Conflict was never natural. It was manufactured and sold back to us as the truth. The connection didn't fall apart suddenly. It weakened quietly, thread by thread. Dating shifted first, no longer a discovery, but a negotiation. Two people sitting across from each other, both wondering if the other was dangerous, manipulative, or secretly acting out a script they learned online.